everyone. Welcome to Macroeconomics. So today we are going to start something new because in the past chapters we have been talking about the micro foundations models such as the production possibility frontier and the supply demand models. So today we are going to switch gear and jump into the macro discussions. And the most fundamental way to start the macro study is to understand the measure we use to track our macroeconomy. So today, in chapter 7, we are going to start discovering how we are going to track our macroeconomy performance. So we will start by understanding the flows of the resources in our economy by using the model called circular flow diagram. And then we will study one of the most popular measurements in macroeconomic study, which is the gross domestic product, GDP. In the future video, we are also going to discover other topics like real GDP versus nominal GDP, and also talk about price index. And particularly, we would like to focus more on the consumer price index in this lectures. So, in the study of macroeconomy, we have to first understand the general operations of the economy. And I think this circular flow diagram is one of the most important and the most intuitive model for a student to understand the flows of all the transactions in the economy. So by looking at this circular flow diagram, I would like to, you guys to define the following agencies in the economy. As you can see, you will have households and also firms. So those are the two fundamental agencies that we always talk about. And additionally, we're adding the government and also the rest of the world into our model so that we can actually make this model a little bit more closer to the reality. Out of the four agents, they are going to interact with each other in three different markets. And here we define the market for goods and services, the factor markets, and also the financial markets. Well, most of the time when we are focused our study on micro foundations, we are usually focused on the market for goods and services and the factor markets. So let's define the two and how the households and firms interact with each other in those two markets. And then we will move on to see, well, how the financial markets might actually be an important ones for us to study. So first of all, households will always spend money. As you can see, there is a blue arrow coming out of the households that call consumer spending that floats into the market for goods and services. And in the market for goods and services, there is always a black arrow going into the firms. That means the money will be received by the firm. And the firm will also be paying out money into the factor markets, which is in the forms of wages, profits, interest, or rents. And those factor markets basically is the place where the firm will find the resources to produce the goods and services. So factors such as human capitals, financial capitals, and natural resources. So those are the things that the firm will need and require to produce the final goods. So money has to go in there, and at the end, well, households will collect those money in the forms of wages, profits, interest, and rent. And as you can see, those are the incomes that we receive usually in our daily basis. Of course, households is not only interacting with the firms in the modern days. Households always interact with the governments as well. So there are two arrows that you can see the bridge between households and governments. Governments will always collect tax from the households, income tax, sales tax, environmental tax, etc. And governments sometimes will also make a transfer payment back to the households in the forms of like unemployment insurance payment, low-income family support, or any kinds of subsidies. So those are the forms of payments that the government will make to the households and the forms of tax that the household will make to the governments. Well, when we talk about governments, of course, they are not only the one to interact with the households, they also interact with the firms in some other way. So for example, when the government starts their services in the society, they're probably going to need an office, or they might need to buy a desk. They might need some paper. They may need to hire someone to do the service for them. And how are they going to get those goods and services? Well, the government will always have to purchase them directly through the market for goods and services. And therefore, money will go into the market for goods and services and flow into the firm again. Well, that's basically the general domestic economy will runs without the financial markets. But there is often the case when firms starts to expand their businesses or their scales in the economy, they will run into problems. They do not have enough cash. So how are they going to resolve that problems? And that's basically the main the key goal for having the financial system. So the financial systems basically is developed in order to have the economy centralize the financial resources into one place so that firms or maybe governments or maybe sometimes households can also be borrowing money from there. So the design for financial market is to reduce the transaction cost for loaning or borrowing or lending money. As you can see, most of the financial markets assets are coming from households. So they are basically called private savings. Households would save money into the financial markets such as bank, saving accounts, checking accounts, or mutual funds, or social security payments, many different kinds. And those funding will be drawn out by agents like firms. So firms would like to borrow money from the financial market so they can expand the operations. So they will borrow the money directly from financial market, or sometimes they will issue something like a stock options. And finally, firms who are getting that money, they will be spending it into the market for goods and services because they would like to buy new equipments, they would like to buy new land, they would like to buy new energy in order to expand the operations. Well, as you can see, not only the firms will borrow money directly from the financial markets, the governments will as well. So governments often borrow money directly from the financial markets, but they are using different tools. For example, the government will not go to your door and say, hey, you know what? I would like to borrow $100 from you. What they usually do is to use the government tools to borrow money, such as the government treasury bonds and the treasury notes. They will sell those paper or government-backed financial products to the market, so people can actually spend money to buy those paper or notes, and the government will get the money they need to pay for the services and goods provided to the public. So in the United States, it's often the case that the government will have to borrow money directly from the households by using those tools. Well, finally, we have covered all the domestic interactions between governments, households, and firms. And we have to now consider the international world. So the rest of the world actually interact with our domestic markets in two different ways. One is through the market for goods and services. And often the case you will heard when we are importing the goods from China or importing the goods from Australia. So those are basically the way how we buy goods from other countries. So money will float out of the domestic markets and going into the rest of the world. But sometimes we also export. For example, when China, they are buying our products, let's say Ford autos, or maybe Apple's computers, or maybe Nike shoes. So those are the products that we might be selling or producing here domestically, and we are shipping out to the other part of the world, and in terms of receiving the money from them. And that's called export. Well, the rest of the world also interact with the domestic market the domestic economy in a different market, which is called the financial market. So anyone in this international financial markets, they can either borrow or lend money to our domestic financial markets. So how they do it, it's basically through maybe purchasing the stocks, or maybe depositing the money into our bank, or maybe they are actually investing their money into some of the company bonds, corporate bonds, right? So that's basically another way how the money will flow into our economy. But at the same time, we can also buy assets from other part of the world. So therefore, sometimes we actually have the money floating out. So that's explain the general interaction between the four different agencies in three different markets. And that pretty much covered the whole operations of the macroeconomy. So now we know how the macroeconomy is generally working. And we would like to basically study a little bit more in depth of the cycles. So as everyone might have heard, there is always a cycle in the economy. Sometimes we go up, sometimes we go down, sometimes we are going through the expansions, sometimes we are going through the recessions. So economy can go up and down, obviously, and it looks like a cycle to us as well. But the problem is, how are we going to tell whether the economy is going up or when they are going down? So there are a number of things that we can track in the economy. For example, we can track the total number of goods and services produced in the economy. Well, during the good times, obviously, we produce more goods, and during the bad time, we produce less goods. Or we can actually keep track of the level of employment. During the good time, we usually have more people working, and during the bad time, we usually have more people losing their jobs. And also, we can keep track of the total value of dollar amounts of goods and services sold. So that means we can keep track of the prices. So again, there is no one definition when we go through the good time, prices will always go up. But generally speaking, when the economy is growing very fast, prices will go up faster. But when the economy is going in a bad turns or going into a recessions, most of the time the price level will drop. So we will look at all of these measurements in our chapters study and also in the next chapter as well. But I would say in general, if our objective to study economics is to find out whether people has a better life or maybe they have an improved welfare, why don't we just ask the questions? Hey, how are you doing today? Are you doing better than yesterday? If we can ask that question to everyone in the economy, we probably get a better measures. But unfortunately, well, number one, it's not physical possible, right? So it will involve a lot of procedures, a lot of surveys sent out, a lot of money spent to keep track of those records. And number two, the problem is, well, when people answering those questions, they usually have some biases. So in general, I would say in order to make a more objective-oriented results or measurements, it's actually easier to keep track of the other three, like the total productions of the economy, the employment level of the economy, and the price level in the economy. And that will provide a more objective-oriented results of the measures. So when we talk about the total output levels in a country, we usually refer to the term GDP, or what we call gross domestic product. So here is a list of GDP characteristics. So GDP basically measures the market value of all the goods and services produced in the economy within a particular period of time. GDP is measured using market value, not quantity. So we never talk about GDP is 10 car plus 4 cakes. GDP includes only the market value of the final goods, not intermediate goods. So what we mean by final good is the good that we actually purchase and use it. Intermediate goods basically are the goods that we purchase, but we are going to turn it into a different forms of goods to resell. So therefore, intermediate goods usually is referred to the production's inputs. GDP includes only current productions, but not other periods. So in order to get a better sense of GDP, you might want to actually ask the question, so what might count and what might not count as GDP? So for instance, if I'm going to tell you, I want to actually measure the GDP today, and I just purchased a pack of chocolate from Safeway. And let's say, well, this pack of chocolate is $5. Well, obviously, that market value of the chocolate will add to the GDP, so it will count. But what if your mom actually tells you, hey, you know what? Buy me a pack of chocolates, and I'm going to make chocolate cake and sell it to my neighbors. Well, when you buy exactly the same pack of chocolate, but you know your mom is going to make something else to resell it for profits, the chocolate that you purchased today from Safeway will not be counted towards GDP. And the reason is because it becomes intermediate goods immediately. When your mom's selling the chocolate cake, the value of the chocolate cakes already include the value of chocolate. And therefore, we never count the intermediate goods value. We only count the final goods value. And when we talk about GDP, let's say in 2010, and do we count the car that we produced in 2018? Well, obviously no, because it has to count the current production periods. So therefore, you have to be aware of these characteristics in order to get a better understanding of the measures of these overall productions in the economy. Well, in the later chapter, or maybe in the later sections, we are going to talk about a little different terminology here. So we will have the terms called nominal GDP, which is the measure of the final outputs produced in a country, which is not price adjusted. And we have potential GDP, which reflect the full employment level of final outputs in a country. And we will mention that in chapter 12. And real GDP, we will talk about in the second sections of the video, where this GDP output is the inflation's or deflation adjusted GDP. So that means it's price adjusted. And the last one is called per capita GDP. So basically is the real GDP per persons in the economy, right? Or divided by the populations. So this is the most common term that we use in our study, and I'm hoping that you can go into the textbook to get into more details of this concept here. So here are some interesting facts about GDP across different years in different countries. So this is the data you can actually find on the World Bank website. Comparing the United States, China, and India GDP over time. I'm hoping you can see this very strong growing trends in the United States. We're always seeing the United States GDP going up every year. China has a very successful growth since the year of 2000s. However, India is still in this very a slow growing phase in terms of GDP. Here, we're comparing Germany, United Kingdom, and France. Again, well, this is an interesting graph to kind of showcase how the European countries, they are closely related to each other. You can see most of the time when one country record a downturns, the other country will usually follow. And when country actually going a expansions, the other country also will follow because they are neighbors, right? Countries with each other. And here we are comparing United States, Japan, and South Korea. And again, Japan, it's a very interesting story to study in macroeconomics. You can see they have been growing very successfully and passed the United States in the 1980s to 1990s periods. But unfortunately, they actually hit a very serious financial problems in the 1990s, and that's basically how you can observe they actually having a very difficult time to find their growing path again. On the other hand, South Korea has been steadily caught up to the world. South Korea is another amazing story to talk about because they were one of the lowest GDP country in the world in the before the 1980, but ever since they actually have been a very strong, powerful countries in the world by looking at their GDP levels. Here, Venezuela, Brazil, and Colombia. Again, those are basically the country very close to each other in the Southern American continent. And you can see how they are closely related to each other. And the interesting story is after the year of 2000, well, which is the time where World Cup and the Olympics happened in Brazil, all the country actually see a very significant growth of GDP in the Southern American continents. And here we are given an example about the intermediate goods and final goods. So we're given a very simple example here. Suppose we have a simple economy that produces 4 goods and 1 service in this economy. So shoes, clothes, concerts, books, and paper. Assume all the paper in this economy is used to produce books. So what is the GDP in this economy for the year of 2015? So first of all, we would like to actually count. So is shoes count as part of the GDP? I would say yes. Clothes, yes. Concerts, yes. Books, yes. But now, as we all know, paper are only used to produce books in this economy. They are not used by anyone else. And therefore, all the paper that we produce in this economy are basically intermediate goods. Therefore, paper is not part of the GDP. So in order to get the total value of the GDP, you can basically use the quantity of each product multiplied by the price per unit. And then you will get the total value of shoes, total value of clothes, concerts, and books, and then you can sum them together. And that's what we call a nominal GDP. So what GDP tell us in general though? So what do we want to measure with GDP? So GDP is a very, very important figures in the study of macroeconomy because we can actually measure the level of overall economic activities in the country. So we can see more products, more transactions being recorded means, well, people are getting more active in making transactions in the economy. It also allows us to measure growth. So over time, if we see, like in the graph we represent before, if we see a country that has a successful growth over time, you will see the GDP continue to go up over time. And we can also use GDP to compare the size of the economy across different countries as well. So to get this measure, we can actually conceptually or theoretically measure this GDP in 2 ways, or can conceptualize it in 2 ways. One is called the income approach, and the other one is called expenditure approach. So based on how we are looking at the flow of the goods and services in the economy, we can actually understand the measure of GDP in 2 different ways. Let's talk about the general case here, right? What do we mean by expenditure approach and what do we mean by income approach? I think the easiest story I can tell here is if you assume there is only a 1-person economy and Sam is the only one who lives in this economy, and we always know Sam is going to spend all of his income on hamburger, which is something that he really likes. In order to identify how much production took place in Sam's 1-person economy, generally speaking, there are two ways to do it. Number one, we can actually follow Sam every single day, and whenever Sam buys something in this economy, we basically just keep the receipt of this purchase. Once we gather all the receipt that Sam's purchased in that one particular time period, we can then sum up all the total spending in this economy, or maybe the total spending on the final goods in this economy, and that should add up to the total value of the products produced in the economy. Well, another way, I would say the easier way, is basically ask Sam, because we know Sam will always spend all his income on hamburger in that particular time period. Therefore, we can literally just ask Sam, hey, how much income did you receive this year? If Sam tells you, I don't know, well, $5,000, well, that has to be the $5,000 he will be spending on purchasing hamburger in that particular year. And therefore, we can basically just ask Sam how much your income is, and that should be the GDP. And therefore, this example illustrates how the expenditure approach and income approach will arrive to the same solutions. So theoretically, they should be the same. Well, when we talk about expenditure approach, we want to get a better idea what kind of receipt that we are going to collect. So there are a total of 4 receipts that we want to actually collect from the economy in order to sum up all the spending in the economy. Number 1, it's what we call consumptions. Consumptions related to all the household spending in the economy. Number 2, investments. That's referred to all the expenditures that the firms and businesses spend in the economy to expand the operations. Not for the current productions, but to expand the future productions. And number 3, government spending. So that's the money that the government spend in order to purchase the goods and services in order to provide the public service to our society. And the last one is net export. So net export, it's basically the net of export to import. So we would like to know how much we actually generate from selling our product. But at the same time, because we are still buying product from outside worlds, so therefore we have to calculate the net of the two. And again, well, we will be practicing this spending or expenditures later. For income approach, obviously, it's very intuitive how we can conceptualize the income approach. So there are 2 markets that we described earlier in the circular flow diagram, the goods and services market and the factor markets. So whenever firms, they are earning profits or earning revenues, the money will goes into the factor of productions in terms of incomes, rents, wages, and profits. And all this money will flow back into the pockets of the households. So for example, Bill Gates is the owner of Microsoft. When Microsoft actually earning billions of dollars of profits, it doesn't mean Microsoft is rich. It basically means that, well, Bill Gates is going to get those profits from Microsoft, and Bill Gates itself, right, himself is actually a household in the economy. So therefore, households are paid for their inputs in the forms of income. And here we are using a notation Y to represent income. So theoretically, Y, which is the total national income, should always equals to the total aggregate spending in the economy, which is consumptions plus investments plus government spending plus net export. And the total expenditure in the economy is also represented by the consumptions plus income, investments plus government spending and plus net export. So regardless how we want to think about this income approach or expenditure approach, they should be very similar to each other because theoretically they are equals to each other. And in the practical sense, most of the countries, when they measure the total level of income and total level of expenditures, those 2 numbers are always close to each other. Well, let's talk about the 4 components in the United States. So in the United States, consumer spending, it's greater spending on the services in the US than on durable goods or non-durable goods. Business fixed investments in the United States is the largest component of investments. Purchase made by the state and local governments in the US are greater than the purchase made by the federal government. Imports in the United States are always greater than the exports. So net exports in the United States are always negative. And those measurements are basically measured and captured by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And it's a division of commerce departments. Here, maybe a little short explanations on how we are adding those components together. Again, you don't need to collect all the little receive that happens in the economy in order to count those measurements. All you need to do is basically say, okay, I know there is a category, a list of category under consumptions. You add them up and you'll come up with a total. In this case, maybe $45. And there's a list of investment spending in the United States, and you add them up, and that is the total investments, and so on and on. You can basically get the total number of those 4 categories of expenditure and sum them up to get the total GDP in the United States. Well, on top of the intermediate goods topics, we also want to clarify why we do not want to add the value of intermediate goods to our products or to our GDP measures. One of the reasons or one of the methods that we can use to avoid that problem is to call the value added methods. So whenever we have the final goods sold in the economy, we can simply break down the value of that product by what has been involved in the positions, involved in the productions process. So for example, if we are thinking about the value of a book, so when an individual writer actually writing a story, maybe that adds $5 of value to this book, and the editor who editing the books will add maybe additional $2 of values. Publishers who format the book will add $2 of additional value, and printer will print the book and add $1 additional value, and bookstore putting the book on the shelves will add another additional $3 of values. To sum all this additional value of the book together, and finally, when it arrives to the market, it might cost $13 for the people to buy it. And therefore, whenever we are trying to count the price of the final goods, which is the book itself, $13, every single process or every single service that got involved in this productions will be the added value to the final price. So therefore, we do not want to add those additional dollar into GDP because we will be repeating in the accounting standpoint. Well, is GDP the perfect measure? Well, seems like, well, we have talked about the GDP for so long, and theoretically, it seems like it gives us a very good measures of the overall activity of the economy. But we are still having some problems and issues with GDP. For instance, GDP does not count household productions, so that means when your mom cooking for you, well, she should be doing some work for you, and that worth some value. And unfortunately, GDP does not count those additional services that happens in the households level. Underground economy is not part of the GDP. Anything illegal trade does not count as part of the GDP. So as you can see, the larger the underground economy is, the more inaccurate that we are measuring the economic activity from the GDP standpoint. GDP does not reflect the well-being directly. So you can actually have a country that is very rich, but then, well, people could be very unhappy. Leisure is not part of the measures included in GDP. So leisure refer to free times. So you can imagine if there is a country that has 10 people working 20 hours a day and 7 days a week, compared to there is another economy where they have again 20 people, but then they only work 8 hours a day and Monday to Friday. Well, the one that has a longer working time and working hours obviously will produce more goods and services, but it doesn't mean that people are actually enjoying it. GDP does not adjust for any pollutions or negative effects of the productions. Again, we can have the factory running the machines 24 hours a day and 7 days a week. But any kind of productions taking place on Earth will create some forms of pollutions. Air pollutions, sound pollutions, food waste, residuals go into our nature. So there are so many negative effects that could possibly happen from a productions. If we just keep producing more without realizing how it affects our environment, obviously we are not creating a good economy to live in. Also, GDP does not reflect any kinds of crimes or social problems in the country. So you can imagine a very high GDP country could have many crimes, or maybe have, like in the United States, we will have a very high divorce rate. And those are not the things that make people happy. And one of the most important arguments from the current modern economy discussions is inequality. You can have the pie built up pretty big, like in the United States, but how the pie is being divided up is a question. Well, in a couple years ago, we have a movement called 1% movement in the US, where groups of people, right, socialists, they come to the New York City and trying to fight for this inequality of income. So they are making arguments. Most majority of the wealth in the United States are held by 1% of the populations, and therefore it makes it so uneven how those incomes or wealth or resources are being distributed in the economy. So that's another very important issue that GDP does not reflect good on. So we have talked about so much on GDP, and I hope that now you have a very good understanding, or at least a fair amount of understanding about GDP. Now, well, in the next lessons, we are going to talk about the real GDP versus nominal GDP and do some calculation together. All right, so I will see you guys in the next videos.